going to call this January 18th Sammamish Planning Commission meeting to order. Let's start with roll call. Syed Safavian.
Here.
Carrie Bosworth.
Present.
Mike Bresco.
Here.
I'm Mark Boffman. Ajay Chakrapani.
Here.
And John Bachman.
Here.
I'm just going to mention that if you've watched these, you've gotten used to the meeting accessibility statement, but with the state of affairs at this point, we're going to start skipping that, at least for this evening, and we'll see how things go in the future. Next, and by the way, if you ever want to know how to watch the meetings or see the meetings or come to the meetings, it's all on the website, so please go and have a look there. All this information is there and linked. Approval of the agenda. Anybody have any comments about the agenda for this evening? Great, so we'll call the agenda approved. Approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was January 4th. Anybody have any corrections to the January 4th meeting minutes? Nobody has any corrections, so we'll call the January 4th meeting minutes approved. Next is non-agenda public comment. So this evening, our topic is critical areas ordinance update. If you have comments other than that, now's the time. Does anybody like to make non-agenda public comments? Looks like Mary would. So go ahead, Mary. As a reminder, this is 3 minutes per person or 5 minutes if you represent a group.
Hello, Mary Victor Sammamish for over 23 years. I wanted to share something happy with you tonight. I know it's a DVD, CD, you probably don't know what those are anymore, but I got this almost 10 years ago from, I was listening to NPR radio or something or other TV during the Olympics, and it came up and I learned that there's actually studies that are done about happiness, like books written on it and everything. And so as part of Happy, they have like a 2-hour video on things that make people happy. And then because I bought the CD, there's a bonus extras part, and the second one is on Curitiba, Brazil. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's actually pretty world famous. It's the gold standard for sustainable and green planning. And it's because of Jaime Lerner. He's a gentleman. He's passed away now because he was 84 when he passed away. But in the 1960s, basically Curitiba was doubling in population. There were a lot of things going on and they wanted to save the city, so they were doing green spaces and other things. So what he did is he wanted to change the city center, and he knew that there would be too much upheaval if he tried to do it over a long term, and they tried to show plans to people and it didn't work. So he decided he was going to do it by demonstration. So he went to his public director and he says, this main avenue that all the cars drive on, we're going to turn it into pedestrian thoroughfare. We're going to do it in 48 hours. And the public works director said, you're crazy. Doing that would take like 6 months. And he said, well, we're going to try it. So they started on Friday. They finished on Monday. It took about 72 hours. And they did turn it into a public thoroughfare. And it became one of the most popular parts of the city in just a few months. People would go there to walk and shop and attract. It was way better than having cars. And at that point, the people who'd been against it went up to Jaime Lerner and they said, you're the mayor. Here's our petition that we signed against what you're doing. We'd like you to keep it as a souvenir, because what we'd like you to do is do this to the whole downtown area. Thank you very much. So it's a really great thing. It's very inspirational. They recycle 70% of their garbage. They have things where you can trade your garbage or your trash for recycling, and you can get food or bus token credits. He also changed the bus system. So the bus rapid transit system that you've maybe seen, it's in about 300 cities around the world. It started there. They just use painted bus lanes that are dedicated and very fast, and a lot of people ride it. I think 85% of the people in Curitiba, Brazil ride it. The other thing they did, which is noted worthy, which is one of the reasons I'm bringing it for Sammamish at this time, is they used kind of a regional stormwater plan where they were having trouble with flooding. And they decided, hey, we can make these artificial lakes. So they made the artificial lakes. They're stormwater, but they're really beautiful and their aesthetic value. You can bike and ride everywhere for about 75 miles around the city. And recently, the articles from 2018 to 2020, they started generating hydroelectric power, and I think it produces about 14% for the city. So Curitiba, Brazil is on here. I did write an email to the city commission, which I'll forward to all the commissions on Sunday probably, and it's just really worth watching. I only gave you slides from it because I can't give you the DVD. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Anybody else for non-agenda or anybody on the phone? I guess it's not on the phone anymore. on the internet?
I see no hands raised.
Great, okay. Thanks. Let's move on to our main business items this evening, starting with the main agenda topic, which is our critical areas ordinance update. And I see two wonderful people sitting right in front of me, so I guess I don't have to look around at who's doing the presentation. Avril and David, hand it over to you.
I'm actually going to start our presentation.
We're going to hand it off to
handing
Jackie.
it over to Avril. Let me just get my screen shared real quick.
You guys have to tell me to slow down next time.
All right, if you can see my screen, I should be all set to go. Is that a yes?
Yes, we could see
Yes.
the screen. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Jackie Baleel, and I'm a management analyst with Community Development. I am joined tonight by Avril Beatty, who is our current Planning and Permit Center manager, and our consultant team is online as well. We have Nell Lund, Jolyn Gilly, and Alan Wald from DCG Watershed. So the purpose of tonight's presentation is to review the proposed changes to the critical areas ordinance that have been identified by the project team. We will go through each change and give everyone a chance to ask questions or express any concerns. There are 6 types of critical areas, and we have chosen to split these 6 between the meeting tonight and our meeting on March 21st so that we can do a deeper dive into each one instead of a surface level of all 6. So tonight we'll be focusing on critical aquifer recharge areas, which you might also hear referred to as CARAs, frequently flooded areas, geologically hazardous areas. We'll do a quick overview of our project timeline. So we last met on this in October of 2023 during the Joint Planning Commission and City Council meeting, where we presented the findings of the review and analysis of our current critical areas ordinance. So those reports that we went over last time are the best available science report, the existing conditions report, and the gap analysis. Those are all available on the project page of the city website. At tonight's meeting and our meeting in March, we'll go over the proposed changes before we go to council for their input. And then we will bring a draft to Planning Commission in June before your public hearing in July. And then we will go to City Council for review before their public hearing in November. And then we are also planning to host a booth at the farmers market in the spring for public outreach. And we'll share that. We should have a date probably at the next meeting, so we can share that probably next time. So just a reminder of the overall process. We are required to review and update our critical areas ordinance to align with best available science, and our deadline of December 31st is set by state law. In this case, the critical areas ordinance is happening parallel to our comprehensive plan update, so we are working closely with that project team, and the update must follow the Department of Commerce checklist, and it also must be reviewed by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Ecology. So the 6 types of critical areas, we will be focusing on the first 3 tonight and the second 3 in March, but we also have an additional layer of the areas of special focus. Those were chosen by the City Council and identified as being unique and special to and important to Sammamish. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Avril. She's going to dive into the proposed changes. We are online and available for questions at any time.
Hello. Avril Beatty, current Planning and Permit Center manager. Welcome. So for these proposed changes, tonight we are not looking at the minutia of wording. We're not looking at draft changes. We're not looking at strike-throughs. We're not at that level of detail yet. I love food analogies. So we're thinking of this as Our critical area regulations are like a recipe book. We generally know the recipes that we need to have and that we want to have. And so what we are bringing to you tonight are, here are the basic recipes that we want with the main ingredients. Do you agree with the direction that we're taking? And so we're not going to get into, is it 2 tablespoons of salt or 1 tablespoon of salt? Do we let the dough rise for 12 hours or 20 hours? So we're not getting into that level of detail, but this is like general direction for how we want to change the regulations, not the specifics of it. So critical area ordinance update, this is a huge chunk of work. These regulations are very complicated. They have different purposes. They protect different things. And to not just help you and the public, but it also to help staff wrap our heads around all of this information, we've created these summary sheets for the various types of critical areas, and those are in the packets for you. These will also be posted on the critical area website. And the idea behind these was to make sure, instead of having like the reports that were previously prepared, instead of having a big document with all the different topics spread out throughout these large documents, we wanted to distill down. If someone's just interested in geohazard areas, or if they're interested in streams, if they're interested in wetlands, they can go to these summary sheets and they can see, why are we doing this? What is being protected? How have we been protecting them? What do we need to do moving forward so that we're following best available sciences and meeting the needs and the things that are important to the community? So we've distilled from these big, thick reports, we've distilled down to these summary sheets, which at the end, we put in a list of the direction of changes that we want to go in. And at first, we just had a big pile of changes. Then we realized we can't just throw around a big pile of changes. We needed to categorize them. So these categories are either ones that the GMA requires that there be an update to address a thing. So those are the category ones. They're kind of no-brainers, pretty straightforward. They shouldn't be controversial, and we're just following best available science and moving along. Category 2 are things that could have different types of impacts. They either need a little bit more deliberation, a little bit more consideration. It might result in something that requires more staff work, either now in analysis or in the future as part of a future work plan, maybe. So it's something that it's like a medium sort of complexity. The category 3 are either things that we would really love to do, but unless the city wins the lotto, we might have a hard time doing it in the near future, or it's something that might be easy to do, but could greatly impact either the critical areas themselves or people who own property along those critical areas, things like that. So we need to be more careful in our analysis and how we end up phrasing and creating and working language into what will be the code. Any questions at this point about these categories? Okay, great. Oh, yes.
The question about the category 1, it says no action needed, which means that there's no need to update?
Excellent question. I would love to clarify that. So we don't need you to have to waste your time and energy thinking about it. There is so much we need from you guys. We don't need you to spend your very precious time worrying about the category 1 stuff. So those are things that maybe they're a clarification. It's something that the GMA calls for anyways. So we don't need you to say specifically call out, yes, make sure you do the thing that GMA, we're taking for granted that you want us to follow GMA to make those updates.
I'll jump in here too. It's more prescriptive in nature. It's something that doesn't really leave a lot of discretion and decision on the part of the city, but we have to make a change in our code or a policy change. So we're just moving it along. It really doesn't warrant elevating it for discussion because we have to do it.
So in the other words, what we're saying is that administratively we'll handle. You don't need to bring it to the commission.
It'll be in the packet. You'll see it in the code changes eventually down the line, but there's really nothing to debate or talk about.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, yes.
I have a question. So let's think about, I'm going to, keeping in mind the recipe example that you gave as of this one. Let's take category 3 over here. When you say category 3 is a map indicating the location of existing wells and the respective aquifers to be used in a well monitoring program, what does a well monitoring program do? Does it say that right now we have to go down 10 feet for it, and in 10 years we think it should go down 20 feet because there's going to be more people and more usage of that water, people are going to draw more from it, so we think that the water table will go down, and so it's 20 feet. How does this work? I'll also preface this with another point. I grew up in a town, in a city, where it was very common for people to drill 250 feet into the ground to find a bit of water, right? So when I looked at this in the prep and also for Mary's questions about CARAs and all those things, I started thinking, oh my God, why are we defining it so late? I mean, so sparsely, when things can change between one drought year to the next drought year and so on and so forth. So how would you make this monitoring do that work?
I appreciate you jumping ahead. We are going to get into that. So after we had sort of calibration on what our categories are, we're going to go over those first 3 types of critical areas in more detail. So I am not going to remember everything you just said right now, but I hope you do. So that way when we get there, I want you to say all of it again.
Yes, got it.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you for being so kind about the jumping ahead. I usually get a whack in the head.
I do it too. It's fine. Any other questions about the types of categories that we have? Okay. All right. Pew, pew, Jackie, pew, pew. All right, so, hey, critical aquifer recharge areas. So, as you all know, we have our fantastic water and sewer districts provide the water to almost all the residents, most residents. There are very few, this is a little bit of an aside, there are very few new wells that are ever created in Sammamish. In the last nearly 5 years that I've been here, we've seen 1 application for a new private well. So I'm just going to throw that out there as perspective. But lots of larger wells that are managed by water districts, and we need to make sure that those aquifers are safe. We need to make sure that there's not ground pollution going into them. Sorry, I'm sort of jumping ahead too. So we know what they are. We need them to be healthy. We need them for everybody to be healthy and safe. And so in doing these summary sheets, because we are asking these questions for every single type of critical area, we are making sure we're not missing anything. So when we think about what is being protected with a CARA, it was brought up as part of the best available sciences that there are forever chemicals that are out there that are leaching into water sources. I hear about all these reports of microplastics everywhere. So there's all of these things that need to be considered in helping protect these CARAs so that we have safe water supplies moving forward. Jackie and I were trying to come up with like a fun sound instead of just saying next slide, please, but we haven't worked that out yet. Thank you, Jackie. Tempting. So for the category 2, so these are ones where we want to make sure we've got direction, support. We want to know if there's any objections. These are this category of proposed changes are based on the best available science reports and gap analysis reports that we had done with DCG watershed. So there's a lot of things that, and this is going to be an ongoing theme, there are a lot of things that require clarifications and definitions. So you're going to see that a lot. We have a lot of things that need to be clarified about what creates risk, what would be exempt from a permit but might impact a CARA. So we have all of these things that we want to clarify sections of the code, but then also have some things in the code to help support the creation of guidelines and information so that it's easier for people to understand. So some of these would be regulatory, some of these would be more informational. So like encourage signage along the right-of-way. Would we want new development to require posting of car identification signs? So things like that. So these are what our subject matter experts and staff have agreed to as being something that we should do. I don't need you to decide anything right now. You've got time to noodle over all of this. But if you have feedback now, it's very welcome. So in thinking about CARAs, and if you want, we can go through each one of these. It's your time. If you've read through the packet and you've read through the summary sheets, if you've read through the previous reports, maybe you have, fantastic. Any feedback that you have about these where we don't need to go into detail for each one, like this is your time, I want to use it as efficiently as possible, and David wants to talk.
And add one thing is that we have been working with the water, the Samplat and the Northeast District on these. They're the primary water providers in the city. They do operate our wells. We do have some private well operators that they range from individual homes that are connected to wells to what are they called, Class B well systems, where you have a cluster of homes that are operated off of a well that they operate in common. We haven't reached out to those groups, but I think that's a bigger picture. We have been closely working with the water and sewer districts. I know over the years they've given us a lot of feedback on things they'd like to see in our codes, and this is the opportunity for them to work with us on that, and some of this comes from that. It's, CARAs are also known as wellhead protection areas, so you might hear them called that in other cities' codes. And as Avril said, generally the goal is water quality and quantity. And one of the challenges we have as a city is that when we draw down our aquifer, it's susceptible to contamination and infiltration. So we want to be working closely to make sure that whatever's being put in the ground on the surface doesn't end up ultimately in our drinking water. I think that's really what the point of most of these is.
So David, can I ask two-parter? One, you mentioned private, what I'd call private wells, as opposed to the Sammamish Plateau and Northeast Sewer. So any idea like how many of those are there in Sammamish? Is it a huge number or a small number? I have no idea. I mean, if you said 10, I'd go, oh, okay. If you said 500, I'd be like, sounds high, but I don't know.
I don't know.
So that's part of, I think, that other one that Ajay was talking about was mapping them and doing an inventory. I do know that the number is decreasing because every time we have a large parcel that has a well that's developed, they get off the well and they connect to municipal water. So the well is usually, what's the term that they use for it when you decommissioned? Thank you. But that is something we want to do, but it is something that will take time to complete an inventory, work with the state to get all the logs, identify where they're located, map them, identify contact with whoever owns and operates it. That is like a longer term work plan that we'd like to get on so we know where these are. But for now, we're really hyper focused on the classification of wells that are operated by the public utility that provide municipal drinking water to the public.
My experience is that the Department of Ecology has a pretty good tracking exercise on all those wells. So would definitely be worth talking to them. And then just also related clarification. So is everything we're talking about with this topic apply in the same way to those public utility wells as to private wells? So in other words, if we say, change X or do X or whatever activity X is allowed or not allowed, it applies the same because it's still a well, or does it not apply the same?
So we have, a lot of these are based on where things are located and how things are mapped. So our critical aquifer recharge areas are for when we have wells that tap into aquifers that serve a larger portion of the community. Because we don't have currently property by property information on existing wells that are being used, we don't have a way of having a regulation to make sure that people don't contaminate their own wells. So go ahead.
I was going to say, so we have the different zones. So we have the CARA 1, CARA 2, CARA 3. And depending on the classification of what type of CARA you're in, depends on the restriction on what can happen on the surface. So really that's what these rules are doing, is governing what can happen on the surface. And usually the CARA classification corresponds with the presence of a certain type of wellhead. It's those wellheads that are, as Avril said, that serve the broader public are the ones that result in a higher classification of CARA that has an additional layer of restriction. The others are more just peripheral to that. We don't have protections for individual wells that I'm aware of. And part of that is we don't have maps that show where all those wells are located. Nor can we necessarily, it's really interesting because if you read some of the rules around private wells, there's notes around that certain types of, and this is the King County Public Health, what do you call it? I had it earlier. It's not the manual, but it's the King County Public Health laws, that there are restrictions on what you can do adjacent to private wells. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about much higher level, larger scale restrictions that can, on what can happen on the surface around certain geologic landforms that also are being used for wells, because they've gone out and studied where these aquifers are located, and they then insert wells in those locations to tap into that water and draw that water and provide that as a municipal water source, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I understand the concept. It just seems that there are some things like forever chemicals that should just be restricted, period. And whether we know somebody's got a well there or not, they shouldn't be doing something they could get into. Plus, if you have a private well, I don't understand the geology of this area that well, but an aquifer is generally connected to the other aquifers in the area. So somebody with a private well over here that goes down 150 feet, contaminates that. How far is that from contaminating the one that's down 300 feet that's serving the public? I think we should just be clear about how we intend to apply whatever we decide to do under this topic.
So it sounds like you don't object to us creating additional regulations to address forever chemicals.
Well, for myself, I say yes, that's correct.
Yes.
Kind of follow up on Chairman's question. I think that, and also AJ talked about the need to have some visual things. How about the numbers? Is there any way that we can look at it and say, okay, you give me some numbers as far as for different classification that we were talking about? It would be nice to kind of put that into perspective. For instance, what is a good example? Frequently flooding area. Do we know the acreage? How much of the total land in the city is it under that category?
So we do have data on some things, not as much data on others. Like, we don't have all the abandoned, decommissioned wellheads mapped in the city. We generally know where, or we do know where the frequently flooded floodplain
I saw
identified
some
areas.
maps in the,
Right.
in the report.
There are things that we do know that are mapped. If we, as an organization, find value in having like data sets associated with each type of critical area,
That would put the whole thing in perspective.
yeah.
Relatively speaking.
I agree there would absolutely be value to that.
The other question that I have, I see the reference made on these points that I'm looking at. Clarify definition of significant increase. Who makes that decision if this is a significant increased risk or not? Is that a subjective issue? Is that, who defines
So
that? Is
that would require a professional hydrologist to be hired to make a
So
determination.
that person makes that decision if it's significant or not?
So this is where we would want to work with a professional hydrologist to create and clarify that definition. Because right now, I am not a hydrologist of any kind. I have no idea what would be considered a significant increased risk or not. Most of the public wouldn't either. So having that sort of definition so that we all have something
So
to
you
reference.
rely on the experts?
Right, yes, we would absolutely rely on experts. And then, just like any other critical area, if we have an applicant saying, it's not that much of a risk, we hire a third-party consultant. And that the applicant pays for to have a third-party review. And we see if that expert agrees with the first expert. And if they agree, great. If they don't, we cross that bridge when we come to it.
And these items that shown under category 2, are these the statements that applies to what we have or we add into what we have?
These are things where we either want to add to what we have or modify what we have. So where we say clarify or strengthen, that's to address an existing thing. Where we have create, that's where we would want something new that we probably don't have right now. There are plenty of places within our codes where we have gaps, where we need to create something to address that issue so that it's not causing any further brain damage for anybody while protecting the thing it's supposed to protect. So that's why we try to be very careful in how we use the words in the summary sheets so that it was clear what we're trying to accomplish.
So when we say that create the guidelines regarding the alternatives to chemicals for pest management, so we don't have that, we're creating one?
We currently do not have one. Having something in the code that would allow staff to create a guideline so that it could go forward with using best available sciences, we think would have value, which is why we have it in our suggested
Thanks
changes.
very much.
Yeah. So do you guys want to go through each of these? I know there was already some questions about frequently flooded areas. If there's no objections to this slide, we could then go to the next one, see if there's any objections, go to the next slide, or that might be help us manage all of your feedback instead of going back and forth.
And that's just for the cars?
So we're doing cars first, and then we'll go to frequently flooded areas, and then we'll do the geological hazard areas.
So I'll suggest that we not just read through the list, because we can do that.
Yes.
But we should talk about questions and comments related to this list while we're on the
Yes,
screen.
yes, please.
So I'll ask Ajay has something for this list.
Yeah, on this list, and this is just one small question I have. You, on point number 3, say clarify which types of infiltration tests are triggered by certain development. Are we proposing to build that kind of a legend or a table for people to know that? Or do we have that and we're going to now go and explain that as a requirement when people build something?
So that's something that we are going to be working with. We've gotten a lot of feedback from Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District, a little bit from Northeast, where they have concern about wanting to make sure infiltration tests occur so that the aquifers don't get contaminated. But we don't have anything in our code right now to talk about what type of infiltration test? What is an infiltration test? How deep does it need to go? How much water getting through is okay? So all of those things we don't have in our code currently.
I could add to that, this one comes from the conflict between the cities and the county and cities, state, county, and cities, low-impact development manuals and stormwater management manuals that require, in many instances, when infiltration is feasible, to infiltrate on-site stormwater and manage it on-site. And the concern that the water and sewer districts have is that when we are out there creating these infiltration galleries that projects use, where you dig a hole, you put a bunch of clean rock in there, and you pump all the water into that location, that the types of water that are being pushed into those infiltration galleries might come from a pollution-generating surface like a driveway or a road or even a rooftop in some instances, and that is resulting in increased rate of infiltration, whereby that water is getting into the aquifer at a faster rate and is concentrated. There also is a concern that these infiltration facilities are classified under one set of standards as an injection well. And an injection well is not something that you want to have located in an area that is targeted for faster groundwater recharge, where you're pumping stormwater from a development project into your aquifer. So what we're looking for here is wanting to understand that relationship between infiltration and stormwater management. And what we don't want is a rate of infiltration that will result in a contamination of the aquifer. I think there's a classic example that happened in Issaquah a number of years ago, where they built on the hill, they built that big development, and when they built one of the stormwater sand filters and infiltration ponds that went up there, the sand plat had a problem where water was infiltrating into, it hit a vein or something in the ground, and water was moving laterally into the aquifer, and they were picking up a increased rate of a certain type of substance. I don't know exactly what, but there are articles about it. You can Google it and read about it. And really, that's what we're trying to avoid. So trying to create regulations that really look at the relationship between the rule that tells us we want to infiltrate to manage stormwater, but on the other hand, we want to be careful what we're infiltrating and how it's designed to protect our aquifers.
Everybody's looking down my way. First of all, I want to thank you for this format. As I was reading through this, I would have a question about, well, how do you know where things are? And then you go on to answer how you're going to do the mapping. So just in the way the format's laid out, it answered a lot of questions. My comments are more around coming from some personal experience with building in a critical drainage basin and aquifer recharge area. There's crossover in terms of pervious and impervious surface lot coverage. So I think we all need to recognize that this is only a piece of the entire puzzle that has to get married together with all of those other land use regulations around impervious surface and lot coverage and things like that. So part of the question is, I guess, would be not so much maybe raw numbers, but some sort of illustration of, okay, because mostly single family, here's a single family lot that's in a critical recharge area, and this is the existing lot coverage, and this is what current regulations allow. And if we change the regulations, this is how it would change for that lot. Now, I realize there's, not one size fits all, but some way of describing, in other than real technical terms, what's the real on-the-ground impact to a homeowner or builder. But otherwise, I really like the format.
So as we move forward, and when we come back in March, having something, because there's certainly could be a very different effect for a homeowner. These regulations may not affect hardly any homeowners, but the next developer that wants to come in to shoehorn in their little subdivision could affect them greatly, right? Depending on where they are, which type of car they're in, how, there are parts of the city that aren't in any critical areas. Not a lot, but there's some. So there's a lot of what ifs, but we could try to sort of marinate on how best to put together what the impacts could be.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard, in a public meeting or at the farmer's market to explain this without being able to provide some sort of real-world examples. Maybe you can just pull existing permits, take out all the identifiable information and say, okay, for this permit, this is what had to happen in this particular situation. Or in this one, there were no critical areas, and you only had lot coverage and impervious surface.
Yeah.
So I like to have a pun in every planning commission meeting, so I'd like to inject a comment here.
Done.
I do think that, kind of tagging on what John said, one of the things here, it's easy, for me at least, it's easy to get caught up in, this is all about new developments, residential developments in particular, but new development, sort of that construction category. But I think it may be helpful to try to, as we continue this discussion, put some framing around other situations that are not just a new development, and is that even relevant or not? Certainly, certain kinds of chemical use that shouldn't be done anywhere, or maybe, pesticides could be used in some places but not others. There are just other things beyond just development that sometimes you can get trapped in that. This is all just about development, but actually there are other things I think that apply, and it'd be good to fold that into the conversation, which, to John's comment, if there was a sketch or a cartoon type diagram or something that says, hey, here's a well and here's the water and here's 3 things you can't do or something, I think that would help people get their hands around it if they're interested.
Yeah, I think putting together a hypothetical sort of case study could be very helpful.
It's one of those topics that, to me, talking through the words, if you're familiar with it, it's not too hard to understand. But if you're not familiar with it, you almost have to have a graphic to get the 3-dimensional, here's a well and here's a circle and, that sort of thing. Sorry to inject. Go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, it was interesting looking at the maps, which I've looked at before, and it looked like the Safeway Plaza was right on top of Acara. So how do you read all of this and think about these regulations and then look at the map and be like, there's a whole shopping plaza right on top. So what does it actually mean in terms of what's happening on that site? Just at a high level, how does someone think about that?
Well, the way I would think about existing development is it generally was built under completely different rule sets. Development like that, there was some wetland fill that happened there as well over time, right? That's definitely an old wetland floodplain that probably was filled in and built on top of. With regard to the critical aquifer recharge area, it's so the way I always have thought of critical aquifer recharge areas is they either affect the geometry of a development because or the type of widgets that you have to install. to protect the aquifer. You either are limited on the amount of impervious you can have, different types of impervious, things you have to do to treat the water, right? So the geometry or the widget for new development, but for existing development and uses, there is a whole section, I just was looking at it right now, about admittedly, and I don't want to use this word, but I will, it's admittedly a bit sad. There's one section in here that talks about use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. Residential use. In all CARA classes, application of household pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers shall not exceed the times, rates, concentrations, and locations specified on the packaging. So, it's kind of like, okay, but does the packaging say don't apply it in a CARA? So that's the dilemma that we have is, then how do we regulate this? And the stormwater team has been through something similar recently where they've been really refining how they handle the different types. People can't wash their car on the street or in your driveway. You can wash it on your lawn. Well, you might argue that in a car you shouldn't wash it on your lawn. And they have the ability to fine, and there's a sliding scale for fines. Not saying we do that in CARAs here, just noting that it's a challenge for us for ongoing operations about how things operate, because we have to have a very clear code that enables us to enforce. And with operations, then you need to have more code enforcement staff, because now you're actually influencing by regulation how people run their lives. And that's a bit more challenging, costly. It's a staffing thing at the end of the day.
Right. The other thing, since we're on the first one, but it kind of affects all of them, is I just want to acknowledge the amount of public comment that we got on this particular topic. These critical areas, geohazards, erosions are very highly personal to the residents of Sammamish. And so, often you hear, well, we have these regulations, but people don't feel like they're being enforced. So how do we bridge that gap and make people feel comfortable that we're doing this work and it's actually being applied?
Yeah, so with development, it's applied through plans that are submitted by applicants, designed by qualified professionals or engineers, civil engineers largely, when we're dealing with erosion and, not CARAs necessarily, but some of the other categories. And it's enforced through inspection. And there's two different categories of code compliance that we deal with. It's code compliance cases for people who are doing something that is not associated with or related to a permit, right? So you just went out and decided you wanted to regrade your yard and you didn't apply for a permit and you're violating our codes. Well, that's a code compliance case. But if you have a permit and you're doing something that is non-compliant with the terms of the permit, that's different. That's not necessarily a code compliance case, that's a permit compliance case. So that's handled by the building division and the permit teams. We don't approve a permit that, well, we try not to. It does happen at times. I won't say we never do. Approve a permit that's not compliant with our codes. Then it becomes, up to the neighbors, or excuse me, the property owner, the builder, to follow the terms of the permit. Construction is inherently messy. People look at a construction site and a trained eye will not see what's going on and will automatically think that someone is out of compliance with their permit. But to a trained eye, you'll see what's going on and you immediately understand you look at the plan, you look at the field, you look at what's going on in the condition, and they're in compliance. And at the end of the day, the mess gets cleaned up, it's contained on site, and there's no way to build something without being messy. It's just, sure, you could precisely build something, way more costly, takes a lot longer. So we're faced with the duration of time something's under construction versus having a little bit of a messy construction site that meets our code requirements. Things are contained, but getting it done quickly, right? So there's a balancing act that's happening out there. So I may not be answering the question specifically. What I'm trying to say is that we review permits to codes. we issue permits, we inspect sites to permits. And some might not feel that we should allow that construction activity to happen on that site, right? That, oh, that site should be protected. It has these features. We agree there are features, but you know, the one thing that I have learned over the years, sitting through multiple hearings, sitting through state court appeals, dealing with attorneys, dealing with the various aspects of development permitting, is that number one, and I'm not trying to convince anybody here of something, I'm simply stating a fact. Number one is private property rights are a real thing. Number two is there's a tension in permit or in development regulations with property rights, between development regulations and property rights. And if a government goes too far or is too heavy-handed, that's a taking of a private property right. The government cannot tell somebody that they cannot use or enjoy their private property. And if the government does that through a property right or through a regulation, then there is a regulatory takings, and the government then is on the hook basically for the value of that property. So we are walking a fine line with critical areas rules. You've heard in our past presentations about reasonable use exceptions and the relief valves that are present, but we're walking a fine line with critical areas rules between trying to protect the function and value of that resource or that asset in the community and allow development to happen. Because if we completely go too, I wouldn't say go too far, but that's the way to say it. If we go that far so that somebody cannot use or enjoy their property, then it's a regulatory takings, and we're going to be faced with a Superior Court appeal and possibly a regulatory takings claim. We have had those. The last time we updated our critical areas rules was when the city added the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area, which was a restriction around subdivisions. And while that process was underway, there was a discussion around prohibiting subdivision as a type of development in the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies overlay, no disturbance area. And a lot of acronyms here, but that's the code, that's what they decided to call it. And what happened was we were faced with a few lawsuits at that time. There is a project that resulted from that. It's called Silverleaf. It's what's called Osgood. And basically the city was sued by the property owner. We'll just leave names out of it, the property owner. And at that time, the property owner settled with the city to allow development of their property within the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area. Otherwise, the city was faced with a regulatory takings claim. So you could see what I'm trying to highlight here is that it's not just we say whatever we want and we can stop somebody from developing their property. We have to find the fine line about protecting the asset, the resource, et cetera, but there is also still the ability for somebody to develop their property. That's why we are so interested in ramping up, and you'll be hearing a lot more about this in the near future, the Transfer Development Rights Program, because we believe there is an opportunity for an alternative relief valve for use of property whereby it is put into conservation easement and we are able to find the right ratio of sending to receiving whereby it provides that alternative economic use of that property. So it's a lot on that topic, but I think that's going to be something that's going to continue as a background in this conversation. So it's probably worth taking a minute to talk about that tension between property rights and the right to develop property versus critical areas rules. And, if you go back and read about when critical areas rules were first put in place and King County was doing all this work, I mean, there were protests, there were people out with tractors, pitchforks in Fall City and all these, it's a real thing. And we've come a long way and we have pretty good rules. We're trying to fine tune them. We're not going backwards on them. So if you see anything where you think we're going backwards, please let us know. But I want to make sure that everyone knows there's no proposal to go backwards on anything. If anything, it's a refinement. It's how do we get a better outcome? And how do we even set aside more land that shouldn't be developed on by finding alternative paths forward?
Got it. I appreciate that lengthy answer. Thank you.
Well, since we've all had our say, actually, I was going to come up a level, actually, kind of where you were at. The fact sheets, the sheets that you provide are great. What I found missing was what overall are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to make the regulations, tighter or less so? And so maybe, whether it's done on each summary sheet or for the whole critical areas, that kind of tension, David, that you're just describing, here's what we're wanting to do. We want to clarify, tighten rules as much as we can, recognizing that there's important individual property right considerations. And the reason I came up with that or thought about that was as I was looking at, and you have it up here in the category 2, review allowances for work exempt from permit. So will you review those to make those it harder to get exemptions or easier to get exemptions? Can't tell from what's here. But if there was that sort of like, here's what we're trying to accomplish overall, that might be helpful in terms of guidance. So that was the overall, like, we want to make dough level.
Right, right.
Not do you need it for 10 minutes or whatever. And while I have the floor, one other one that just was interesting here for me to try to get my head around was, and maybe this ties in a little bit with the property rights and all that, but the last bullet about forever chemicals, it seems like that should be a category 1 no-brainer. Like, how could we ever want forever chemicals going into the aquifer? So it just seemed out of sorts from the way the categories were defined. So those are my higher level comments.
Anyone else on this list? Is this all of the category 2 or is there more?
Jackie, was this all, I tried to get, sorry.
There we go.
I think this is the only one that has 2 slides
Yeah,
for category 2.
looking at the packet, I
We
thought
tried really
that there
hard
was.
to consolidate them.
Let's see if that lines up. Yeah, so Jackie, can you go to the next slide? The one thing I want to just express agreement on is under category 1, it talks about a definition for injection. And I really think that in my mind, we've been taught, or at least I have for many years, that infiltration is a good solution for how to manage stormwater so it doesn't leave the site, doesn't, right? And it's a natural environment thing. You want the water to go back in the soil. And so when you start kind of talking about, well, now I'm not so sure about some of these infiltration issues, but to me, where infiltration, I think, becomes more of a problem is contamination, of course, and there should be some regulations around that. But more so is when it becomes injection, when we're bypassing part of the natural system. So I really agree that injection needs to be better defined. And once that's done, then I would be all in favor of severely limiting the opportunity to utilize that as a strategy, not just in the CARA 1, CARA 2, but in general throughout the regulations, that injection is, in my opinion, generally a bad thing. But you have to define that line between infiltration and injection somehow, even if it's imperfect, so then you have something to work with. And so I think I'm agreeing with exactly what's said here, but I wanted to express that as an agreement.
To put a little more emphasis on that, the challenge is, I believe the state definition for an injection well is an infiltration facility that is deeper than it is wide. So that's where the challenge comes from, is that, okay.
Yeah, I hear that. I do think, though, that a lot of people, if they go, well, that's just, not the best use of words. But I think, people would say a water garden in your front yard that captures the water off your roof and infiltrates it is a great thing, right? Managed properly. It's a great thing. Everybody would be in agreement with that. But a commercial building where they go out and drill a bunch of 12-inch diameter, 6-inch diameter, whatever, holes and shove pipes in there and run all of the water off their parking lot into that is not a good thing. So even though the words might not be used the best, surely we can thoughtfully come up with something to at least attempt to try to put some restrictions around figuring out how to encourage infiltration and the appropriate contamination removal, but not allowing injection any more than, we can.
Right.
So underlying this, that actually might have as much impact on our groundwater as anything else we do in here, in my opinion. Okay, other comments, particularly on these two here? Go ahead, Syed.
Couple of comments. I believe that John brought up the low impact development. Can you talk a little bit about that integration of the low impact development concept in the critical area ordinance? For instance, can a developer build something as long as you're okay with the low impact development that is in the wetland?
So we want wetlands, as an example,
Right.
To stay as much in a natural form as possible. Like they've evolved and they change every year with their vegetation and whatever rainfall we have, whatever. So to have an artificial water course come in, which is just a way of saying to have water come from someplace else that it wouldn't have come from otherwise, that's generally not best available science supporting having foreign water brought in to that wetland.
Right.
So we want people to do infiltration. We want people to preserve their wetlands, but it's a matter of how, right? In those situations, you don't want to mix your waters. So how do you do things so that you can have your critical area protected and you can have your infiltration? So having both are important, and we need to have regulations to support both or require both. But depending on what it is, there may not be a good opportunity for overlap. So you may not be able to have a portion of a property multitask.
But it is possible to integrate the concept of low impact development.
So you could
critical
have low
areas.
impact development adjacent to, so it's a matter of how. It's a matter of how would it get done. I think I would be very hard pressed to see someone design something the right way so that it actually worked well.
I want to add about low impact development because there's an important sort of genesis behind the term low impact development. Sometime around, I want to say 2005, we started in the industry hearing a lot about this thing called low impact development. And back then when it was first conceived, it was really a land use practice. And what it meant was that you were designing your buildings to fit the land, that you were retaining existing vegetation, that you were minimizing the amount of excavation that you were doing. You were being as minimizing the disruption to the maximum extent feasible. And over time, the term low impact development has really, I feel like, been taken, I don't want to use that word, but taken by the civil engineering world and has been turned into something that is really focused on stormwater. And the focus of low impact development on stormwater has moved away from holistic land practices and has instead focused on infiltration, on things like watershed sequencing, and on, it's a good thing, but what it's done is it's taken away the whole site planning concept and avoiding the impact in the first place, right? And now we're talking about low impact development. If you use it in the way the city's stormwater manual uses it and the way the stormwater team uses it, is really all about how we manage stormwater from a built environment, from a built site. So when I hear the word low impact development, I think of it in, it's like, well, what did it used to be and what it is now? Holistic land development, might be a better term, whereby we're trying to find a way to retain existing features, to minimize the removal of vegetation, to replace what's lost, right? It's that in critical areas, you hear it differently. We use avoidance, mitigation sequencing, avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. And the goal that goes throughout our critical areas rule set is avoiding the impact altogether by design, then when you have to impact a critical area, minimizing it, and then when you do minimize it, you are required to provide compensatory mitigation for the impact that is caused to the resource. So that's something you'll hear threaded throughout the background of these rules, and just wanted to make sure to highlight that, because LID, low impact development, has taken on sort of an identity of its own in today's stormwater world. And I hesitate to use that in the context of critical areas rules unless we're talking about stormwater management.
Second question is that all these code amendments, I just tried to make a list of the agencies that are involved in this: EPA, Fish and Wildlife, Army Corps of Engineers, Department of Ecology, Department of Energy, FEMA, Parks. I'm assuming that these updates or these code amendments would be consistent with those guidelines of those federal agencies or state agencies, right?
We have a lot of referencing back to other agencies, coordinating with other agencies. A lot of times, like U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, right? Like federal agency, they're not looking at whatever we do is an additional layer to whatever they require.
But they should not be in conflict.
They generally aren't in that particular instance. So someone might need to get a permit from both the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and from the city, and it is on the applicant to reach out to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, figure out whatever they have to do, and the onus is on them to make sure that they conform to all the regulations. And if you have one that's more lenient than the other, you're going with the stricter one so that you can conform to both. As of yet, within Sammamish, I haven't had an applicant come to us and say, you're telling me something completely opposite from this other agency, like this is an absolute conflict, I can't do both. That hasn't happened that I know of.
But I'm just bringing it up.
Right. No. It's a good concern to have. It's a good concern to have.
I also want to highlight that the city's rules, we're at the ground level. We're at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? And we're dealing with applicants that want to build stuff and issuing permits for them to build things, and our rules are generally far more restrictive than theirs are. So,
And
for
it's
example,
okay by the court? It's okay to be restricted?
for example, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulates jurisdictional wetlands, but they only regulate jurisdictional wetlands. They don't regulate wetland buffers. So, the State Department of Fish and Wildlife issues hydraulic project approvals for work in water, but they don't regulate stream buffers, right? So we have not only regulations on what can happen in the wetland or in the stream, but we also have anywhere from a 25-foot to a 200-foot buffer that we also regulate around that resource. So our rules are generally far more restrictive than what you would find being applied by the state or federal agencies, because those state or federal agency rules are tailored for a very specific purpose. Whereas ours are far broader in what we're doing. We do follow the direction from the Growth Management Act. There's a whole section in the Washington Administrative Code on what critical areas rules must include, and we must consider best available science and use best available science. And we've done that report. We've provided that. And now what we're looking at is applying that and how to refine our rules. Again, no backsliding, but we're refining them going forward based on what we know. And in many instances, there's an incremental ratcheting down, and it's becoming more restrictive. I don't see any instance where we're just saying, we're not going to do that anymore. In fact, it's, we need a bigger buffer, or we need to not offer as many flexibilities, or we need to do a better job with review of mitigation and follow-up on mitigation. Like, all these things are things that we're hearing through our best available science review and the gap analysis.
I guess a good example, Mike brought it up, forever chemicals. EPA, I believe that they banned it, did they?
Possibly. I don't know. We could look into that. That's a great question. You know, what forever chemicals, you know, what federal, state, or county rule is there in place? And we should know what that is. So we'll follow up on that for sure.
I just want to point out that you said we're at the ground level, but on this particular topic, the ground level is actually the top of the system, so. Respect. All right.
Can I throw one
Go ahead,
more
Mike.
top level? Yeah, also, I seriously at the top level, because I mentioned about maybe like what are we trying to accomplish overall? It might be interesting to know what significant changes in best available science since the last update, because that drives some of these changes as well. So food for thought. And that could be something that is at the front end or somewhere on each of the fact sheets, changes that are driven by the science. So something to think about.
So we do have Nell Lund here in the background, and you know she's been through a few of these critical areas updates. Dan Nickel as well with Watershed. They've been around. They've seen the science, the last round, and they've seen this round, and they might be able to. And I won't put them on the spot too much, but if they anecdotally could just say, you know, based on their impression of what's happened with the, you know, the science, is there a big, you know, difference between what the science said last time and what it's saying this time? Or is it kind of saying the same thing, but we need to do a better job?
Yeah, this is Nell. I can jump in. I guess speaking more broadly to the six, all the critical areas, the general trend is a refinement and also an incorporation of incorporating resiliency to climate change as communities are looking at that. But for the most part, there have been a few synthesis documents from ecology on wetlands and wetland buffers and mitigation effectiveness, for examples. And so there's some best available science updates, recommendations to incorporate that information to, you know, improve the effectiveness of critical area protections.
Anybody else? Go ahead, Sid.
So we talked about six categories. I have lists of other ones that I don't know. How about erosion control, where that would fit?
So this evening, we've got the CARAs, the frequently flooded areas, and geological hazard areas. Geological hazard areas is a big umbrella,
I see. That goes in.
and we've got it's got all the hazards. It's got erosion hazard, it's got landslide hazard, it's got seismic hazards.
Steep
It's
slope?
a lot.
Steep slope.
All of it. It's got all of it.
So they're included,
It's coming.
even though that
It's
you
coming.
didn't list them.
Yeah.
One observation that I have just working here and having worked in other places and reading through different rule sets is that we do aquatic resources pretty well here in the city. We do streams pretty well. We do wetlands pretty well. The area where I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement is our geohazards. I'll use the word, it's a mess. And we really want, you're going to see here soon, if we can get to that slide, that we really want to focus on that with this round of updates, and not backsliding, but refining and making it simpler to understand. Because when people don't understand rules, they tend to just do the work anyway. And you have to make it understandable and applicable, and where people know what they're allowed to do. Otherwise, they're just going to do whatever they're going to do. So I don't know if we want to move to the next slide, if we're done with CARAs.
I'm all in favor of, let's move on to the next slide. Anybody have any comments about the category 3 ones? I would just say I had to read through these a couple times to really understand. I'm not sure if that just indicates that I was not reading carefully or not, but this is requires a little bit more paying attention.
So you'll see that for the category 3s, it's all about the mapping. Where are things located in real life? And so trying to figure out what needs, like in the field data verification, where there are other sources of data that we can pull in. Geographic information systems can be an amazing tool if you have the data, if the data's good, and if you can display it clearly in a way that is digestible, because some of it's not. So being able to spend the effort, hiring consultants, having staff do the work to either get the data, compile the data, make it pretty. That's why these are under category 3. These would be great things to do, but these types of changes specifically would take like staff time and budget.
Go ahead. So these all make sense. So I don't want to get down to the weeds here, except, so at what point would you look maybe for us to help guide whether it makes sense to put that budget and time in? Is that going to be like June timeframe or whatever, or is?
So as we move along in the overall process of our update, we're going to be looking at future work plan items, and we'll be prioritizing. And because right now, I couldn't tell you how difficult each one of those would be. So one of them could be like, yeah, that'll only be like 20 hours worth of work versus this other one is 60 hours worth of work. At this point, we don't know. I don't know. But being able to figure it out so we can prioritize is going to need to happen.
Okay, and that'll be coming at some point. As some of the earlier comments is, oh, the maps would be great, but we, like you, don't know how much effort that would take and, you know, whether that would be worth the effort or not. So thank you.
This is one area I had questions on. This one with the well monitoring programs that we have. At an overall level, again, I'm not going into the teaspoon of salt versus 2 teaspoons of salt, but generally at an overall level, do we have a kind of a metric to say, here's what a monitoring program will look like? Here's where a comparable city has had a successful monitoring program? Or are we going to, using the metaphors again, are we going to break fresh ground over here for this?
So we don't currently have a well, the city doesn't have a well monitoring program. I don't know if the water purveyors would have a well monitoring program.
I think King County Public Health does for certain classifications of wells. But we, you know, again, we're going to have to go on a data hunting exercise to find the wells, the classifications, et cetera. This is a whole program. It's a creation of a program. Once we, I have an inkling though that this is really us collecting data from existing sources and putting it together and tracking it, and that it's not as intense as it might sound once we have it figured out, but we really haven't had a chance to assess where those data sources might be, what types of data they have, and then how we would classify things or report things. I think this is a potential dashboard item, you know, water quality in the city, water levels, you know, but then how do you interpret that and allow the end user, the consumer, to see what that means? Because if you look at the raw data, you might not know.
So the second question was related to one of the points that was mentioned about a county, city-county line of decision. My father, God rest his soul, was a civil engineer. He used to always tell me that water makes up her mind as she flows, right? So when that happens and they cross over, water crosses over from a city line into a county line, whether it's through stream or however it finds its way and other things, do we know of ways that we will engage with the teams to get this? How regular are we in going back and checking up and saying that, okay, this is now crossed over and we need to now engage a bigger group than what we have? I'm just trying to find out how deep or how robust should our, again, monitoring be to figure out the trends for the groundwater.
Yeah, we don't currently have a program that would tell us that for groundwater. The water districts likely do with regard to their larger wells because they have to track those and monitor those for the amount of production and the amount of pumping they can do. If you read in the water comprehensive plan for the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District, there's a whole chapter on monitoring outputs and aquifer levels, and that there are indicators in there around when they switch to their tie over, whatever you call it. They're connected to the Cascade Water Alliance, and what happens when we in the summer pump our aquifers down to a certain level is they switch the valve over to pull water. It's metered water from Cascade Water Alliance, and then they pay for that water. The problem is that water is generally considered to be of a lower quality than the water from your aquifers, so you're blending water at that point in time, and that's something they don't like to do. It's really interesting. I mean, if you have a chance, pulling up the Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District Water Comprehensive Plan and taking a look at it and reading through the executive summaries and skimming through the chapters that might be of interest, it's a pretty interesting document if you have some coffee.
Got it. And lastly, this is a nit. Point number 2 says maps of abandoned wells within designated CARAs, so they contaminate local aquifers. Should they that they don't contaminate?
I would love to say that we did that on purpose to see if you guys were paying attention. We didn't. We forgot the word. Don't.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah.
But
thanks for paying attention.
Yeah.
So Jose, are you saying the water doesn't respect our political boundaries?
What's politics?
Yeah. So I think what David's saying is herding cats is hard, and herding this data that might not match up across jurisdictions might even be harder. So while it would be nice to dream, figuring out how much work it's going to be is going to be real critical.
So I had just a couple of suggestions, not asking for commentary necessarily, about how this gets communicated. And as I said, it took me reading through it a few times. The first one, I think it's easy for me to read that and think, well, don't our water districts have all of that information already? Why are we talking about this being an additional big effort for the city? But it's probably, there's more to it than that. So maybe the words just need to describe that a little bit more. And the last one, if you just read through it pretty quickly, it seems like we're making a map of people breaking the law, which seems like a bad idea, right? Because it says, create a map indicating locations of currently prohibited land uses. So
we could use the term legal nonconforming.
Yeah, I think making it so that if this gets more discussion from people, they understand what that is actually all about, right? And I think I conceptually do, but the wording probably seems super obvious to you, but to the average person, if they ever get to the point of reading this, that's going to be like, what? It's prohibited and we're not stopping it, we're making a map of it?
So we might want to also soften that one in a way that makes it sound more collaborative, because what we don't, it's telling someone that their legal non-conforming thing that was legally established now has to be removed is fraught with legal challenge. So I would say that we would add in there that should be possibly retrofitted is one way to look at it. And another is we need to figure out a way to add more of a collaborative tone to that, because we as a community allowed those things to happen, and we as a community need to figure out how to address making a change, as opposed to simply putting someone on notice that, hey, you got to stop that. It's a collaborate. It's a community issue at the end of the day.
Like I said, that seems obvious, right? And for you, it is obvious, and talking through it, it seems obvious, but to somebody that doesn't really know too much about this, when they read that, I think they're going to scratch their head. Now, this is category 3, and maybe we don't get into that depth and this becomes a future topic, but still, I think the wording on that could probably help the discussion. Anything else on recharge? Can we move on to the next topic? Okay.
Second on the list, frequently flooded areas. So frequently flooded areas that flood, pretty self-descriptive critical area. This is more about public health and safety, making sure development isn't occurring that's going to end up literally in the water. So making sure that we've got, well, okay, so there was a question about where these are. These occur within the city of Sammamish along the shores of Lake Sammamish. It doesn't, we don't have flood areas along Beaver Lake or Pine Lake or any of the other lakes that aren't defined as lakes by the state. So Evans Creek Preserve, I think, is also designated as a flood area, but that's right in the county outside the city jurisdiction. So within the area along along the eastern shore of Lake Sammamish, we do have regulations about what can happen within that floodplain. The idea is that you don't build something that would displace a volume where floodwaters would be, because laws of conservation of matter, that water is going to end up somewhere else, and you're basically inflicting your floodwater on someone else. So there's that component of it. And then when you do have something that could flood, making sure, because of flood insurance regulations, that the structure won't get swept away, that water can infiltrate under a foundation, and there's like special ways of doing the construction, not super special, but just making sure that there's openings that can either break away so water can come in so that it's not pressing against the structure of a building, and that certain electrical outlets aren't below where a floodplain line would be, things like that. So it is more safety than anything else. Pew pew, Jackie, pew pew. So for frequently flooded areas, they're in the summary sheet. We only have some very basic GMA sort of directed changes. Do you have, so they're in your packet. I don't know if you guys have any questions about those or any comments or feedbacks or anything, or if you are just dying to jump into geological hazard areas.
I have one question, and I could not find the answer in there. Maybe it was obvious, but I could not find the answer in there. Consider this past year that has happened. We were, through summer, we were in a bit of a drought phase. We were very low on the rain. And then suddenly, when November and December hit, we just got a deluge of water, and we are back to a normal level at a yearly, if you take a year's worth of rain in that line. But that does have an impact on the environment, which is that it has gotten too much water in a short period of time to work through it. I don't know, I could not find anything to tell that, that kind of an impact would change the flooded areas, or that what would we do if we get more and more of these as we move forward and don't have our usual 9 months of rain in Seattle, in this greater Seattle area. But how do we handle that? Wouldn't that be a Category 3 change? That's the biggest question I have, is that if something happens like that, something happens and it happens at a regular pace, wouldn't this become a Category 3? Why are we just on a Category 1?
So this ties in a lot with a lot of the other critical area regulations that we're going to be looking at. The overall goal of preserving habitat areas to prevent impervious surface where it doesn't need to be there, to allow the infiltration without contaminating our aquifers. All of those things will help the city be more resilient so that we can address, so that way when climate change is happening to us, the impacts aren't as severe as they might be if we didn't do anything. Part of the challenge with our identified flooded areas is because it's on the lake, we don't control the rest of the jurisdiction surrounding the lake. So it's a large watershed. But we can do our part, right? So we can do our part to try to get as much on-site preservation of vegetation so that the soil can contain whatever water it can, versus just having lawn everywhere. So there's all these little things that can happen throughout the city. Might be a drop in the bucket, but it's what we can do to help.
So you're saying this is chapter 1?
The Lake Sammamish is interesting. So it has a constrained outlet that's artificially engineered. There's a spillway at the north end of the lake that leads to the Sammamish River that ends up in the Sammamish River Slough. It's under the land under it is owned by King County, and flanking it to either side is owned by King County. There's been a long ongoing disagreement amongst jurisdictions about how that outlet should be handled. King County historically hasn't managed the vegetation. The vegetation is backed up water during peak flow events, but they see the vegetation as habitat for migrating fish. There's all sorts of pros and cons to it. King County has put together a program, and they're working on a plan called the Willamore Flood Control Project, I think. So if you Google Willamore Flood Control Project, there's a massive report on it and talks about the mechanics about how the lake works and its role in retaining and storing water. So that all plays hand in hand with the desire on many shoreline waterfront owners. They want the lake to be stable year round. They want to have that same level. But King County says, hey, this is a water storage area that's always been a water storage area, pre-development. So there's all sorts of ways to think about Lake Sammamish. The floodplain itself is FEMA regulated. And the reason why we participate in it, and if you look specifically, if you have time, at WAC 365, 190, 110, that's where our guidance regarding frequently flooded areas comes from. And basically it says adopt the FEMA floodplain. So the interesting thing there is that we do that, and if we don't do that, then we're not eligible for the underwriting that the federal government provides from FEMA for shoreline property owners. It'd be interesting to hear from, I know that I've seen this happen in other jurisdictions that changed the way they were engaging FEMA, and it is astronomically expensive to insure your home when you're not being underwritten by FEMA. So when shoreline property owners tell us that they don't like our flood control rules and how they have to build to a base flood elevation and certify it and design the home accordingly and provide compensatory storage, they're trying to fill parts of the shoreline, I have to remind them that they're doing that is going to allow them to get a very, very, very cheap rate on insurance for their shoreline property.
So from a technical perspective, this is a pretty limited piece. We're just adopting the FEMA stuff. And to Ajay's point, really, you're talking more about storm and surface water and critical areas and wetlands and other areas of regulation. But in this particular case, we're just looking at adopting FEMA's floodplain map.
In following WAC 365, 190, 110, yes.
Okay, let's move on.
Can I just add really quickly, just to fully address that comment? There are climate resiliency recommendations for floodplains, but it's more of a comprehensive planning level, like policies and different capital improvement projects or studies that the city could undertake to determine, stormwater improvements that could make it less likely that those flood events could negatively impact wetlands and streams. So in terms of a regulatory recommendation, it was pretty straightforward based on our gap analysis.
Okay, geologically hazardous areas.
As previously stated, geological hazard areas are a lot of things. It includes landslide hazard areas, where you would actually have earth movement coming down a hillside, erosion hazard areas where you just have water and surface, like dirt, getting caught up in whatever runoff, which could scour along a hillside. Seismic hazard is liquefaction. It's where if you have an earthquake and the ground is really sandy, you see the building shimmy down into the sand, and you see sand or dirt like bubble up between cracks in the concrete. So earth movement of some sort is what we are going to be going over here. So given the different sort of scales of things, we don't want erosion because it pollutes our streams and waterways, ruins the vegetation, which would then hold more water, which would help with like flooding and things like that, and help keep habitats healthier. We don't want land sliding down the hills and causing structural catastrophic failure of buildings or roadways. We've all seen the horrible imagery of huge chunks of mountains falling down. We don't see that happening here, but we're going to have regulations just in case. So this is what we're trying to address with these updates. Sammamish is Sammamish because we have topography. We have all these great streams and wetlands everywhere and all of this habitat, and I see deer all the time when I come into work. So being able to make sure these things stay safe and continue to be a resource for all the residents, very important. Jackie, pew, pew, pew. Yay. Okay, so for category 2, we have in our current mapping on the Sammamish property tool all of these various layers. Some of them referred to as no disturbance area, properties that drain to no disturbance area, erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies area, and they are based on old-ish maps. David loves to tell the story. They're based on maps that weren't very precise when they were first created. But now, because of technology, we can have parcel by parcel data mapped out if we have the data. So part of the challenge that we have is the land in some parts of Sammamish inundates and changes so much. You could have a really steep area next to a not so steep area, but our mapping system doesn't really capture that. And so what we want to do is have sort of broader definitions, with the goal being, let's make sure we have these definitions that aren't based on obscure federal maps, which ours currently do, or based on something that was created and served its purpose 20 years ago, but maybe it's not as useful now. So we can have a system in place where we can identify there could be steep slopes here, there could be erosion hazard here, so that way when we have residents come to us because they want to add on to their house or they found a property they want to build on, we can identify, we need more information. This could be landslide, erosion, seismic, whatever it is. We need more information. We need you to get a report so that we can find out for sure. So that's the overall goal that we want to have moving forward. So with that goal in mind, this is why we have these recommendations before you. So part of it is getting rid of references that no longer serve the purpose that we need, expanding references where, like, we don't have any reference to lateral spreading right now. It doesn't happen a lot, but we should still have it because it could happen. And then also looking at, when we have properties that are so severely encumbered with critical areas, in order to have a relief valve, we have our reasonable use exceptions, in which case, like, how can we allow someone to engineer something so that it could be safe, could have, you can engineer a lot of things. It may be really expensive, but it is technically possible. So how could something be engineered so that you're minimizing whatever risk to the property itself and the people in it, as well as to the land underneath it? So that was the approach with these recommendations. Oh, yes.
I want to add a little more to the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies and sort of the history there. So in 1994, King County, at the behest of residents of the area, completed the final East Lake Sammamish Basin and Non-Point Action Plan, which you've probably heard about. It's something that lives in somewhat infamy around here. And that was the foundation for a lot of regulation and protection. That plan predated all of the stormwater management that we have, a lot of the other critical areas rules that we have, and really it was state of the art, cutting edge concepts at the time. Basically, when you're in an area that's susceptible to erosion and unraveling, put the water in a pipe and pipe it down to the lake. Basically, that's what it says. A lot of instances that's too expensive and you can't do that. It also suggests avoiding large-scale development. You shouldn't be chopping up the hillside and creating lots, cutting down all the trees and grading on the hill, because that could result in a mass failure. It's really not either a mass release into through sediment or failure of a slope. So what happened after that was adopted, King County put some rules in place following that, and the city incorporated and the city adopted King County's rules. Those rules have lived in the city since incorporation, and we have had different versions of them. The issue there, though, is that the rules that came from the Non-Point Basin Plan, or I guess the Basin and Non-Point Action Plan, sorry. It was really centered around stormwater management and site management. The whole premise is to try to avoid somewhat of a sediment discharge into Lake Sammamish, to avoid increased, sediment and phosphorus loading in the lake, et cetera, trying to protect the lake. So now we have a really aggressive set of stormwater rules. I would argue that we have the most, I wouldn't call them restrictive, but proactive stormwater rules in Eastern King County. We have very restrictive stormwater rules. I'll just go ahead and say it. So our stormwater rules have eclipsed the requirements that came with the Basin and Non-Point Action Plan. So now our stormwater rules require management of water in those areas, which are the critical drainage areas, in excess of what the plan would have required. Yet we still have these rules in place that also have the remnant historic regulations. So what we're wanting to do is a bit of an analysis to contrast the current state of the art of stormwater management in the city versus what these rules were trying to achieve in the past. These have also been used, I'm just going to go out and ahead and say it, by different factions in the community as a lever for development or anti-development. This has been a bit of a lightning rod for not developing the west-facing slope of the city along the lake. So this is the source of a lot of tension during the last critical areas update. I think there were something like 32 meetings on this topic, and it ended up resulting in litigation. So we're very cautious about this, and we're wanting to understand what we're trying to achieve here, and not backslide, but at the same time simplify, because it is extremely confusing. So we're going to be working on this, bringing it to you, trying to figure out what the right blending of rules is. Whereas we currently have an erosion hazard area, a landslide hazard area. Within the landslide hazard area, there's a steep slope area. There's an erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies. There's erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies, no disturbance. There's erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies, drains to no disturbance. There's a critical drainage area. There's, you name it. These are all geohazard areas that we need to do an assessment of and understand how they work together to come up with one cohesive rule set that achieves what we're trying to achieve. So that's what we're setting out to do here. This is probably the biggest lift of this entire project. And we just want to make sure you all understand that, there's a bit of history here. There's, hasn't always been a happy conversation. And we're really trying to find the right fit for the community.
Questions or comments? Go ahead, Ajay.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, I totally understand. It's not a happy conversation because thank you for prefacing that, because I'm going to say something that's not going to be a happy thing. In your point 3 in category 2, when I first read that, it really got me worried, because it says that it is possible to safely develop on steep slopes when adequate investigation is conducted and appropriate precautions are taken. That sounds a little too peachy, right? So why are we even going there? Shouldn't we be pulling back a little bit? Because we are talking of gravity, we are talking of water, we're talking of so many factors that can go off. I don't even know if we can come up with something that'll be safely developed on steep slopes. I mean, I'm not throwing water at it, but then, why even state that as a goal?
So we have to go back to the whole takings concern. There are properties within the city, 5,000 to 6,000 square foot lots, like in Inglewood, where they are existing lots. They might be right now completely mapped within a landslide hazard zone. If we say, no, you get no relief, then we could be sued for takings. And we're trying to not get sued.
In addition to that, I'd also add that not every slope is created equal. It depends on the landform, how it was created, what it's underlain by. There are some slopes that you definitely don't want to build on. There are others that are glacial till that aren't. It's like, it's not going anywhere. There's also a difference between a landslide and a slough. I hear a lot about people emailing in photos of landslides, and there's a difference between a landslide and a slough. So, soil does become unglued at times when it's on a slope and vegetation is removed. Roots hold things in place, and soil does slough. That doesn't mean it's a landslide. So really just wanting to make sure to call that one out as well, because people will bring photos in and show you all these landslides that they've seen, and we'd like to make sure we're clearly defining what a landslide is. We don't want one. We do see sloughs, they happen. I think the issue here is that our code already allows a reduction of buffer and a modification in some instances, but doesn't allow it in other instances, and it's a bit illogical to us. We don't agree with what the code says because they're almost sort of similar situations. So we're wanting to do a review of when you might allow for a geotech or there is no such thing as a geotechnical engineer. There's either a civil engineer or a licensed geologist. When a geotechnical specialist makes a recommendation and does the right amount of research, and we peer review that from our geotechnical specialist, and they are in agreement that it would be appropriate to customize the regulations to fit the condition and ultimately achieve the stability and security that we're looking for.
Syed, go ahead.
Example that you brought up, Inglewood House was built in a steep slope. Let's say somebody buys that property and they want to demolish it and put a brand new one. Are they grandfathered in, or they have to? Would they be subject to the new guidelines?
So within our critical area rules, we have our exceptions, we have allowances for existing development. So we would, as part of this, we want to make sure any exceptions or allowances are limited in nature, that they have the proper technical experts behind them to make sure it can be done safe. So if you have an old 1930s cabin that's falling apart and you want to build your 3-story, 3,000 square foot, whatever box, but I'm going to do it in the existing footprint. Show me your geotech report. And maybe it's something where the geotechnical expert says something like, yes, you can technically build a new house here. You're going to have 50-foot piers that you are drilling down so that you hit bedrock so that your house doesn't slide down the hill. And then that property owner can say, that's going to cost me like $3 million just to build the foundation. No, thank you. But then it's the homeowner or the property owner that's making that decision. But we are going to be looking at how can we refine, clarify, and have reasonable any exceptions, any allowances, so that way people, when you have a property, you have rights to it, right? So we want to make sure that we find a balance.
So kind of look at it case by case.
So some things are case by case, like the reasonable use exceptions, completely case by case. Other times we have exceptions where you can stay within a footprint. You can stay within an existing buffer. If you have a non-conforming buffer that's already established, you could continue that buffer depending on what the buffer is, what you're doing. So making sure that we have those regulations clearly spelled out, so that way 3 years from now we're not all scratching our heads wondering what were we thinking when we wrote this. So it depends. I hate answering it like that, but it depends.
Well, the reason that I brought it up, I heard that 75-80% of the dwelling units in the city were constructed during the time that it was part of the King County. It was unincorporated, wasn't it that? Something like that. So, and apply the numbers. You're talking about substantial amount of, not necessarily, of course, every houses are built on a steep slope, but take that 75% of those homes.
So the
and if you take a fraction of it, but
yeah.
still
So I have a small group of planners that review every single building permit application that comes in the door. A replacement deck, a small addition, a demo rebuild, patios. So we even have deck additions. It seems like such a simple project. I just want to add 80 square feet to my deck. And we look at the maps, we're like, oh, you're in a landslide hazard area. You need to have a geotech report to show that your deck is going to be safe. And people feel very strongly.
And peer reviewed.
And it has to be peer reviewed. And you have to pay for that. People feel very strongly when we tell them this information. So going back, Carrie, to your comment earlier about how do we know what we're saving? Anecdotally, I can tell you, my planners are constantly telling people, you can't do exactly what you want to do because the regulations don't allow it. So there's constantly working with applicants to modify, to shave back, to scooch, lower, all of it, every day. So it would be really hard to try to quantify all of those changes that we make people do, but they do happen. Did I answer your question?
So the overall answer is that yes, you have the authority to grandfather in, but you look at it case by case.
Right. We look at each and every one, and right now the code has allowances for legal non-conforming. I'm a dorky planner. I use that term. Grandfathered in situations, and people aren't always stuck. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not stuck, and we work with them to figure out, how they can do something.
Okay, thank you.
So remember, there's really three things going on with geologically hazardous areas, and you can say this across almost all of them. You know, the erosion hazards are kind of the entry-level version of the geologically hazardous areas. But you're protecting against erosion. You don't want sediment to move off the site, end up in the streams, fill up the streams with sediment. You don't want sediment in the lake, degrading water quality. You're really trying to protect against sediment moving off the site. And the way to do that is surface treatments. Retaining vegetation is the easiest way. And that brings me to the second one. And this is one that a lot of neighbors pick up on. And this is where neighbors notice the biggest change when we allow development is when vegetation is removed. Because that vegetation also provides habitat. It provides screening, it provides greening of your neighborhood, provides character in your neighborhood, you know, vegetated, beautiful Northwest neighborhood. And when somebody goes in and builds on a lot and they cut down the vegetation, people notice. So I'd say that, but that goes hand in hand with erosion. You really should try to protect all the vegetation. And finally, the last one that's related to geologically hazardous areas is safety, stability. We don't want to see a house fall down the hill. We don't want somebody to be cutting into a hill and trigger a larger landform failure. You know, so we really need to know what they're doing. You know, what is the origin of the landform? What is the proposed action? How are they doing it? What does the engineering say? Right. So you think about those three things with geologically hazardous areas. You know, you're dealing with, you want to protect water quality, limit erosion, protect vegetation, limit removal of vegetation, especially trees, and finally we want to understand what the stability issue is on a site. So that's what we're trying to get at in this rule set. Whereas right now we've got these disparate chapters and sections that are all trying to generally achieve the same thing but say different things. So we're trying to go through and do an inventory, collapse it all down into one section that achieves those three things.
Others? John?
Okay. Your category 3 in this section, I think, encapsulates some of what you need in the other two sections, and maybe some of the sections we haven't even gotten to. That is data. My friend AJ loves that term. I know the city's participating in the regional GIS ortho flights, and you're getting 3-inch pixels, which don't show up on the public site. So there's a disconnect there. But with a LiDAR collection, you'd be able to get super accurate contours, and then you could put your overlays for your floodplain stuff. It just would become a really good planning tool for all of these areas. But it's in category 3 with time and expense. But I think my thought to our group is the more data that the city staff has and the council has, and the public as well, the better job we can do in protecting our environment. So that could be possibly a recommendation to council to beef up our funding for collection of data for GIS, because a bunch of stuff can be attached to that. Like when you take in a geotech report, you could attach it to that parcel so it becomes part of that parcel's history, and the next homeowner or the neighbor might not have to go do a geotech report. Those things can be quite expensive. David earlier mentioned about the TDR program and improving ways to mitigate impacts on these really difficult lots. The next step is for council to think about buyouts. In some cases, it might be cheaper to buy out a parcel than to litigate it or have someone try to develop on something that is just insane, and that provides all sorts of benefits to our parks, trail connections, wildlife, surface water. So I think further steps may need to go beyond just the TDR program to mitigate some of these hazards that we have that kind of are hangover from the old days of looser development regulations. I think that's about all I had to say, but otherwise, rolling this stuff up into better data that both staff have available and the public so that they're more informed.
Thank you for those comments. We definitely agree on those. One thing that you brought up that I think I wanted to highlight here is that the way the code is currently set up is it calls out definitions of critical areas, and some critical areas you delineate them by definition, et cetera. But some of the critical areas in the code we have maps of wetlands and streams and slopes, and we have erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies, no disturbance areas, and the code generally calls out that the maps are advisory, that we use them when, to look at property and see, yeah, there might be a wetland or a slope here. You need to have somebody go out to a surveyor or a wetland scientist or whomever and verify presence, absence, what is on the site, do an inventory on the ground based on the definitions, right? But there's this one problematic section that we have in the code that we struggle with as a city, and that is the erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies, no disturbance area. And the reason why we struggle with that particular section is because the code says that the map is de facto not advisory, that you are to apply the map as it is, and that is where the boundary of the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area is. And within that area, you can only do the following things. But if you look at the origin of that data set and you go back in time and understand how that map was created and understand how we've evolved with data and with spatial mapping, that map was probably not intended to be used on the parcel level in the way that it's being used. And we would far rather be using that as an advisory map and having somebody go out and actually do a field study to determine whether or not it is one of the things that should be protected. And are you trying to extend, or is that?
Right.
I'm just waiting for you to take a breath. Can somebody move to extend to 9?
Move to extend.
Second.
Move in second and extend to 9. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Thanks.
Appreciate the conversation on this. This is saving us time later. So the issue there is that the code also says that you should update the map using LiDAR, which is a great piece of information. That's only one piece, and it's a misinformed statement in the code. You need to update the map using LiDAR in conjunction with soils information, landform and geology information, and that you need to do some interpolation based on those different elements bundled together. So it's like someone forgot the rest of it in the code. So we have property owners continuously telling us, why don't you update these maps using LiDAR? And I tell them, well, I don't know what we would do. LiDAR isn't really equipped to update a map to tell us around, about geohazards and landforms and stability problems, or soils even. So it's slope and aspect, sure. So the issue there is the biggest change that we're looking to make is to decouple that, is to push that into the category that the other critical areas are in, and make, if we do retain that map, make that advisory and dependent on field verification and field study to accurately tell us what exactly is going on the ground.
So why is that category 3?
That was my question.
So I think that is probably a category 2. These right here.
So this one is less of a, we need a lot of money and staff time to do it, and more of a, it's a simple,
will.
yeah. So it's something that could be an effectively easy change that would then have ramifications down the line, because then if they are advisory, then there can be a more case-by-case review for any development of a home, of a subdivision, of whatever it is, deck extension, on those properties. As a small aside, I've always been perplexed that the erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies doesn't actually go all the way to the lake. I guess I know the word near is in there, but it still seems odd that like it stops before it gets to the lake.
So if, you bring up a good question, and I think part of it is our sensitivity to this topic. When I did some historical review of the last critical areas update, I got a little scared. But if you think this is one that maybe as a community we are at a point where we could move it to a category 2, and it's not unreasonable to say, hey, you're likely in a no disturbance area. Can you go have a geotechnical expert go out and provide a report and us to do a peer review? And if it's not in that type of area, then it's not in that type of area. But if it is, well, then let's delineate where that is and what that means, and then let's restrict it accordingly. If that's where we are as a community, I think that's a far more appropriate and educated way to go about managing land, as opposed to using a map that is entirely outdated and was never intended to be used that way.
I guess my response to that is perhaps not, it could be controversial to some people, but my response to that is the minute that the average house in Sammamish passed $1 million, I feel like it's reasonable to ask for some additional types of things in these situations. We're not necessarily burdening someone when they have to pay a little bit for a technical expert to make sure that, they're building the right thing. If we were talking about low-income housing, maybe that'd be a different story. But the average house in Sammamish, if you're building a house, you're over $1 million and probably closer to 2. So, it's a drop in the bucket. People don't like it, but it's a drop in the bucket, my opinion. I would move it up.
Yeah, and perhaps it would be less emotional too. It'd be like, look, we just want to make sure, opposed to it being like, oh my God, you're in this area, you can't do that. I mean, I've had personal experience with that, and it was jarring, and had to navigate that. Bring the emotion back down, and we work through it. But perhaps it could be like, FYI, this is where we, the maps say you are, and we just want to double check. So this is what needs.
Sayed.
Let's talk about time and budget. So the schedule that you're talking about earlier on, you said that you're going to come back in March, right? So talking about the different categories, do you have the budget and a time to go through all the amendments that you need to do within the time frame?
1 and 2.
For the categories 1 and 2, we should have all of the recipes completely refined down to all steps and how long it needs to cool before we can dig in. So yes, for the categories 1 and 2. For category 3s, those are ones that are going to have to be prioritized as part of a future work plan. As far as in the immediate future, we're going to do this sort of deep dive in early March. Based on the feedback that we've gotten tonight, we will be updating the summary sheets for these first 3 topics. That will be included again in the March packet for you. And then we'll be using all of this feedback. And whatever you tell us tonight isn't your last bite at the apple for these. Marinate on them. We wanted, because these ones are more complicated, we wanted to bring them first, or at least the geological are more complicated. So give you more time to be able to think about it before we come back to you in March, because we're anticipating you'll have more ideas, more feedback, more questions, more anything, right? And Miriam is raising her hand.
Sorry, I was just going to add for the category 3s, I think a lot of these, in addition to staff time, would also involve consultant time, right? Hiring those experts to do some of the mapping and that kind of thing, which is outside of the scope of this project. It's also something we would need to integrate into our 25, 26, possibly more budget. And those budgets are going to start to be developed this summer. So I think we'd kind of look for a general indication around what category 3s are ones that the commission thinks are a good idea to move forward with, so that we can start to get just some general quotes around what that might look like from a budget perspective and integrate those into our requests as we move forward.
So David, how would that affect the overall timetable as far as completion of the comprehensive plan?
So these wouldn't necessarily, there might be some policy language we need to add to the comprehensive plan in order to bring them into alignment, not reverse engineer, but, you know, make sure that the comp plan is providing the higher level direction that we need to implement our critical areas rules. We don't always have that direction. We kind of look at critical areas rules and regulation sometimes a little bit in a vacuum from the comp plan. So we're trying to, and we've designed this project so that we have some cross pollination that's going on. So it shouldn't affect the comp plan.
So it doesn't have to be, when we're talking about a comprehensive plan, we're talking about completion by the end of this year?
End of this year, yeah.
Right. So by then, you don't have the entire picture as far as the amendment to the critical area ordinance.
We're hoping to wrap this up concurrently with the comp plan.
Right, and so a lot of the category 3, where it's the mapping stuff, that may not need to be something where the code change, the language that's going to be in the code would still be able to move forward while we put together a work plan to figure out how to scrounge up money to update mapping systems. And so maybe the language is how the maps would be updated. You know, how we define these things, what triggers the need for a technical report, those sort of things. So it's sort of a Venn diagram. We got a lot of overlap between the things that we want to do versus what would actually be in the code. Does that answer your question? Okay.
As long as it doesn't affect the overall deadline that you have for the completion of the comp plan.
I think we might add some policy language directing us to, you know, update and maintain maps, right? Like we don't necessarily have that direction in the comp plan. That would then facilitate adding it to budget, work plan, et cetera, down the line. I would love to have that direction in there. I wanted to highlight one more thing, not to dwell on it too much, because, you know, I told you my recommendation, but with regard to the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area, that is something, one of the reasons why I was put in category 3 is because that historically has been a bit of a political hot potato, because it is something that allows or disallows development in a part of the city that has been green space. So the issue there is that the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area happens to overlay that west-facing slope that is largely undeveloped in the city. And the Parker property, for example, if you know anything about that project, that came in some number of years ago and they wanted to subdivide it, and that resulted in an emergency amendment to the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area rules to eliminate the pilot project. And really what that was is there was a lot of community opposition to developing that parcel. And now there are portions of that parcel that are probably very fragile, and, you know, there's some probably risk associated with it, but there are portions of that parcel that are not. But what we ended up with is the inability to develop any of it. And, you know, so I want to make sure everyone's aware that there's a bit of history here with the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies no disturbance area, and the map being a non-advisory map, being de facto per the boundary of the map, and that making that change results in a different regulatory scheme in the city that might allow some development to happen in areas where it had been holdout from allowing it to happen. I'm just trying to be completely transparent about what making that change would result in. Not to say it's risk or low risk, it's just to say that those areas that are mapped as erosion hazard sensitive water bodies, no disturbance area, have not allowed any development, period.
Well, that begs the question, do we have any challenges as far as critical areas in respect to the town center?
There are some, yeah, within the town center. There's definitely critical areas there, but you know, those apply. It's a typical buffer. It applies. We don't have an erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies, no disturbance area, nor drains to in the town center. All the erosion hazard or sensitive water bodies, no disturbance areas, and drains to are either the westerly facing slope of the city or that flatter upland area right above it, which is the drains to.
Do we have any of the category 3?
Category 3 CARA?
No, category of the critical area ordinance.
Oh, category 3.
Within the town center.
I don't know for certain. I'd have to go back and look and see if there are any steep slope areas. The ravine?
I don't know if I'm comfortable answering that on the record. I think we need to look at a topo map, but yeah.
Ajay, did you have something?
Yeah, so how much does this all line up to our future plans for the city, the 2044 Envision Sammamish plan? Do we have to consider this along with that to see what it is, or has that already been melded into this whole thing, or would that become a factor later on?
We will be melding. So we all work when we're in the office, close proximity to each other, and we're in constant communications between the work groups. So as we come up with language, the actual recipes and the number of teaspoons, we'll be coordinating with the team working on the comprehensive plan update, because we do not want to have a regulation in our critical area rules that would somehow violate a policy or goal of the comprehensive plan as it's getting updated.
So I did cross that line and get into the teaspoons, didn't I?
That's fine. That's fine.
Anybody else? Any final comments?
Thank you for listening to us. It's a lot of information.
Thank you for staying awake. We appreciate it.
And we'll do round 2 in March, right? Okay, look forward to that. Thank you very much. And by the way, I really appreciate, for me at least, having you guys sit right here, because it's more conversational and it just works a little bit better. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. Okay, let's move on to our director's report. Deputy Director Hildy, are you doing that?
I sure am, and I am going to keep it really brief. So we can get to public comment. First of all, good evening, and thank you all so much for the wonderful comments and feedback that you all provided at our last meeting on January 4th regarding ways to improve how materials are reviewed and processed through the Planning Commission, how we could kind of enhance our communication when it comes to work by the Planning Commission to the general community. And most importantly, how we can get maybe a bigger following, people coming to our meetings. We may use the critical areas ordinance update as a recruitment video. No, just kidding. It's always good to look at ways on how we can continue doing the good work we do and make improvements to that. So I really want to thank you for your feedback and suggestions and insight. Just to recap, for those who weren't able to attend our January 4th Planning Commission, really the key takeaways from what staff heard was really valuing our joint meetings and workshops with our city council and other commissions. We had a great workshop on October 21st that just generated a ton of feedback on our comprehensive plan, and would like to see more of those, and I think that's fantastic. The need for clear communication about the city's role in various initiatives, requesting access to PowerPoint presentations before meetings, clearly communicating project timelines and where we're at in a project timeline, could be in the middle, beginning, or end, suggesting a decision matrix for managing trade-offs, improving how we communicate decision-making processes to residents, promoting the Planning Commission meetings to encourage community participation, and proposing a newsletter feature to inform the community about upcoming meetings and all the topics being discussed. So we discussed this as a group last week, and this is fantastic, and we do plan on incorporating it into our work program. So you're going to start to see some of this come forward as we bring work to you for your review. Regarding the PowerPoint presentations, we completely understand the need for that early access. This is one that we are still discussing on the best approach and how to do that. Just for transparency, we are typically working on our presentations right up to the meeting. I will be honest, there have been times where I have come into this meeting and I've literally just made a change. And that is because we are either updating information from our consultants, we're getting public comment that we want to make sure is incorporated into the presentation so we can address if there's any concerns. Also, we have meetings with our chair and vice chair the week of the meeting, and their feedback on the material is really important, making sure we're clearly communicating that. But with that said, we've heard the request, and we are looking at ways that we can do that. So bear with us. We may unroll some pilot program this year to be able to get you access to those PowerPoint presentations. So more to come on that. We're still trying to figure out a plan on how best to do that. Again, I really do want to emphasize the thank you and the feedback we heard. We are just as excited to incorporate that, and we hope that makes a difference as we are reviewing a lot of complex topics this year with the Planning Commission. So thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to be proactive here. Could someone move to extend an additional 10 minutes so we don't have a problem?
I'll move to
Or
extend.
pick a different time if you want.
Okay, I'll move to extend.
Does anybody want to second that?
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and second that we extend to 9:10. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Okay, let's do public comment related to our agenda topic for this evening. Do we have any public comment? Mary?
Hi, Mary Victor. I'm Sammamish, 23 years. I did email a couple things in, including some from Barbara Robbie on related things, so I hope you look at those. I'm a big person for maps. They always call them as Mary's maps. They're not. They're the city's maps. I just print them, spend my money, and hand them to you. You all got this environmentally sensitive areas, which are called critical areas now, geologic hazards, and the colored stuff, the red stuff, the land hazard, the steep slopes, and the erosion hazard. You can see it's not all over the city, it's just on that edge. So if you are somebody and you want to buy a property, you need to know, hey, it's going to be hella hard to build here. I'm going to have to do a geotech report, and maybe I won't do that. Maybe if I bought, maybe I'll sell my lot, get a TD, transfer of development right for town center, and then maybe live up there. Also, if you're one of the houses, critical areas, environmentally sensitive areas, the first times they were required was in 1990. So if you have houses that were built before 1990, they maybe got to build in these. And I always figure that those people should feel like they're lucky that they have the dwelling that they do. And if they want to put a big backyard or a great big outdoor living thing or a giant deck, they're going to have problems, which is why Avril said that her staff ends up doing it. Also, I live at the bottom of a landslide steep slope, and if 5 people above me do something that's 100 square feet of impervious, that's 1,000, which is double the amount allowed just if you're at Pine Lake. And if I have more people that do it, you reach the 2,000 threshold, and there isn't stormwater facilities. So in addition to all the things that they talked about, and this has been an excellent meeting, and thank you, Kelly, for a great report, and thank you to whoever brought food, because she was talking about food the whole night. You have to say, like the area I live in Tamarack, it's from 1964 before there were subdivision regulations. There is not stormwater controls everywhere, even though we've improved the code a lot through massive accounts of advocacy over the last 10 years. There's still old septics. There's people that have 30, 40-year-old septics. Those septics are going into the ground. They're hitting those soils. They're hitting those limiting layers. They're following the gravity, as Ajay talked about. And they're coming out lower in the hill, places that didn't used to have water. So I think David is interested in simplifying it. The way you simplify it is you need to know what your soils are, because there are definitely places where the soils are better and definitely places where they're sandy, and you're going to do very different things, and you might be able to build on those. But you are going to have to do the geotechnical report. And what I don't like is we do have steep slope hazard definition. It is regulated as a landslide hazard area at 40% or more. It's never noticed. I haven't seen anybody have to put anything on there. There's something simple called notice of title. Like my house, built in '96, has a sensitive notice on title. It says you're in a sensitive area. Go ask the city if you want to do anything. So when I wanted to paint my house, I came in and asked. When I wanted to put my roof on my house, I asked. When I want to change windows, I asked. And I'm half in a landslide, half not, and I'm at the bottom of a slope. There are certain places on my own property where you wouldn't want to do something because it is a steep slope hazard, and I am revegetating a hill, trying to do the right way, so one day you'll have code to say how people should do that. To come to just shop at Safeway the other day, I had to get out of my house and I just drive by this little hill by Mark Cross where he lives. It's a little tiny steep slope that's perfectly mapped. I couldn't get up with my Prius. I tried twice because of the black ice, so I had to go back and get my all-wheel drive car, which I barely made it up this tiny little 120-foot steep slope hill. It's a steep slope. The rest of my road is pretty flat. So you really, really need to protect these areas. So we do have maps. These are from 2003. They're good maps. Use them. It's okay if they're advisory, but don't not use them. And I will tell you, sometimes something isn't mapped that needs to be, or something is mapped that is incorrect or needs modification. So you need to be able to allow people to adjust that. We did that for stormwater code. There's a drains to area called landslide hazard drainage area, and there's a landslide hazard area. And the city basically wrote code with Tani Dalzell, and we did it over a couple years, to say the city can choose to say what those mappings are or use them or not. So I think that that's what you need for the other things. Steep slopes are actually in the current comp plan. It took me 3 years just to get legend put on the map, and they're still not being seen. I've seen recently a development thing that we put in forward still isn't mapping the steep slope hazards that you can stand and see from the road next to the property. I mentioned I lived in Tamarack. Oops. Tamarack is in this red area. This is a map done by the city for subbasins looking at drainage, and you can see there's blue. That's where it's mapped landslide. A lot of people living there, they don't know they live in a landslide hazard area, but they do. And if they've got built, they're probably not going to be able to extend their house. Then this yellow is steep slope hazards, which is mapped from 2003 data from King County, and it's very accurate. My house is right here, and like every little pixel on there is absolutely accurate. There might be some areas that are wrong, but it's in general very accurate. So until we can do what John Backman said and what David Pyle said, to be able to do new things with new technology with maps, use the maps that we have. Go ahead and say they're advisory if you want, or if you don't want development in the erosion hazard just yet, then you can think about that. But wherever there's yellow, where there's no blue, those are steep slope hazards that are not in a landslide. And then here's landslide, and then here's where they overlap, and then sometimes there's landslides and no steep slopes. So you do have multiple things. You have to look at them. It is complicated. I also did a map that I think I shared with City Council and you. These are the actual landslides that occurred. Now, David says if it just sloughs, it is a landslide. You don't want it sloughing. I've had that happen within 2 inches of my home. My neighbors had it within 10 feet of theirs, and it's from water that didn't used to be there. The reason that we had it is there's been so much building in the area that's older. There's water that goes into the ground. It's till up there. It becomes more sandy lower down, and it comes out. We actually have water coming up through the road above me, which never used to happen before. It's called groundwater seepage, and it's because the old development used old stormwater codes. They didn't do the things they need. They didn't do the reports, and some people are expanding their decks and other things, and we have a lot of old septics in the area. So we really shouldn't be developing in those. In fact, the Growth Management Act says you should not be developing in critical areas at all. So they should be other places. And then I read today, I think in the critical areas handbook, they shouldn't put anything new into an urban growth area that they want to develop that has more than 15% critical areas. And I think if you go back to the original map here, probably about 15% of the area is critical areas. So we really shouldn't have development happening in these. In fact, I think the city should be reduced in their growth counts for everything they put in critical area. You really shouldn't be building there. So I did send in a bunch of emails. I started a mapping thing that I did with staff that I didn't finish, but I hope that as we put in inputs today, and there might be more coming in from me or other people, that you would consider those, because we're not going to get to hear again until March. But thank you for all the work. There are maps. Try to do the reading. It's all really tough to learn, and you guys had great questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Anyone else or anyone online?
Yes, we have one commenter online. Mr.
Okay.
Eastman, I'm going to go ahead and promote you. James, you're ready to speak, or would you like me to just go ahead and start the video?
Eastman, Sammamish Parkway. I took a first crack at making a video today, and Evan has it.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Shot during a rain event on December 5th. There's a total of 7 drainage courses which travel through my property. This particular one on the far southern edge, according to the East Basin Plan, in a pre-development state, would have moved very slowly through the subsurface into the lower channel, delaying storm peaks by many days or weeks, greatly reducing the magnitude of peak flows. The East Basin Plan further states that following development, however, upland runoff no longer infiltrates into the subsurface. It is collected by the storm drain system and runs off clear and compacted ground, even if that ground is later landscaped. This flow then erodes from the very top of the western slope, forming a new channel and transporting substantial amounts of sediment. These videos are very quick videos shot over a minute. Now multiply this by hours, days, and years, and the severity of climate change to visualize the effects of water. This is a drainage course water coming down from Waterbrook, very turbid, flows rapidly, and it's a short distance away from the lake. And finally is some water from the middle of my property. It's ditch water, same thing, very turbid on its way to the lake. You might wonder yourself, why is that stormwater so dirty in those previous videos? And this pictorial somewhat paints a picture, at least it does on the north end of my property. But here you see a bunch of circled development in red. And here we see roughly 8 houses that all drain to a storm drain here, which puts the water out and concentrates it in what we call point discharge, and then it goes down this hillside and then into a ditch and out into the lake. That picture we saw there in the middle was taken from right there. So releasing this stormwater in a point discharge is like shooting a fire hose into the ground or taking a pressure washer and going into the ground. And then you also have houses with driveways, with sport courts, with all sorts of impervious surface backing the plateau. Here we have entire neighborhoods with streets, sidewalks, more streets, all gathering impervious surface water and draining it out through these point discharges. And it's getting a start at 400-foot elevation and it's going down to 50 foot. So that's quite a bit of fall, and on its way it picks up all sorts of sediment, and this sandy sediment is full of phosphorus. That's why it's a topic of concern. It causes the algae to grow in the lake, which therefore robs the lake of oxygen and makes it hard for the fish to survive. So from a bird's eye view, these areas don't look like much, but from a street view, there is a ton of impervious surface caught by these streets, sidewalks, houses, all making its way down to those point discharges. This is the Timberline neighborhood. So I just covered the worst case scenario, and that's when entire neighborhoods are point discharged at the top of the plateau, but that doesn't cover the amount of homes backing my property on top of the plateau whose front yards might drain into a street which is piped down the hillside properly, but it doesn't cover the backyards. These backyards include water that hits the ridge line of the house and flows to the back of the house, down into a gutter, and then down a downspout that empties into the backyards. These backyards also have decks, they have sheds, sport courts. A lot of them have just grass back there, and all of the topsoil has been removed. And in this condition, it's almost instantaneous from the time that the water hits the back of the house or anything in the backyard till the time it flows off the edge of the lot and into these ravines and hits those streams, causing the erosion shown earlier. What would have happened in the natural state is this would have been all forested, and it would have been 6 inches to a foot of topsoil, which would have acted as a sponge to collect this water and to slowly release it over time, preventing the instantaneous flows in these videos. So as already described earlier, we have a bunch of water coming from the top of the plateau, crashing down the hillside, picking up all sorts of sediment and phosphorus, and then going into the lake. There was code language originally as part of the East Basin Plan and then as a part of King County that allowed a landowner whose property the stormwater was going through, it gave them the ability to develop their property as long as they can make improvements to the stormwater. For instance, they could install missing infrastructure, water treatment, something that would better the stormwater quality going into the lake. Unfortunately, this code language was deleted when Sammamish incorporated, and that's why today we still see these exact same issues 30 years after the East Basin Plan was passed, and this dirty water going into the lake. So my goal is going forward is to work with the city as a landowner to come up with a code which allow me responsible development of my property and the ability to fix the stormwater quality and to increase the quality of the water hitting the lake. I've proposed 80 acres of ecotourist use, which is still a use of property, but I would like to do it under the existing tree canopy, provide engineered solutions to clean up some of the problems discussed earlier, and then development concentrated for housing on roughly 20 acres of my property with engineered stormwater solutions. And no matter what happens, I'm committed to no net loss and a overall increase of stormwater quality going to Lake Sammamish.
We're getting very techie with our public comment. Thanks, James.
Yeah, fun format change there. One more comments. Mr. Stickney, I'm going to go ahead and promote you to panelist.
Good evening, planning commissioners. I just thought I would ask, since I watched so many meetings, do you need to extend the meeting or am I good to go?
Go ahead, Paul. We're just doing public comment, so you're okay.
All right, good. Good comments tonight by commissioners, staff, presentations. Very happy to hear most of this. All of you had really good things to say. I wrote notes down on all of it. I won't read it in now, but just congrats on a good meeting. I think this is a sensitive topic that is being handled well. A couple odds and ends, and by the way, I constructed this comment during the meeting. It was not, pre-made. You know, you talk about landslides. I know a hydrogeomorphologist, and that's a mouthful. His name is David Montgomery. He's with UW. He's the guy that did the Oso landslide. And I talked with him a bit about a earthquake that happened in the region in about 800 years ago. We have a big one every roughly 400 years. And it was either the quake of 800 years ago or 1100 years ago that pieces of Lakemont slid into Lake Sammamish. That's where those trees are. Pieces of Mercer Island slid into Lake Washington. And to David Powell's point, that is a landslide. Okay, in the spirit of today's meeting, not being so much in the weeds, but being holistic, overarching policy direction, I would say the state has a lot to do with critical areas, both the GMA and critical areas. Our 4-county region has a fair piece to do. And keep in mind that a little over 60% of the land in our 4 counties is resource land without any, development. Roughly 23% is rural on average home sizes of 5 acres, and 16% is urban where the people are, which includes our city. Saeed Savavian is correct. 85% of the homes that exist today in Sammamish were either built before 1999 or in the pipeline. Sammamish has done 15% left. And I believe a very strong policy direction is to have strong prescriptive critical area protections and for what I call Goldilocks housing supplies to meet our own community's needs for lifetime and legacies. We should do both. Sammamish Plateau Water has roughly 13 wells. Northeast Plateau has 5. I suggest we get maps, we as the Kings we, of all the carers around all of those and talk to them about what would they like to see. Mark Bachman's correct. Department of Ecology has all the well datas of drilled wells. And to do a pun like Mark did, it's been kind of dry and cold, which creates static. That got me thinking about static levels in wells and how have the 13 wells of the 2 water districts static levels changed, or have they? Have they gone up? Have they gone down? And how many injection wells are in Sammamish? I don't think there are many, but I don't know that. It would be good to know if there are any at all. Okay, about CARAs now, specifically. Within the circles that surround the CARAs that are identified, or CARA, tomato, tomato, I'm not sure how to say that. What percentage of the land is developed within each of those circles? What percentage of the remainder could be developed, and what percentage will be all open space? Hugely important context to judge what the right policies are, because there was a comment by Saeed about talking with existing homes versus new development. That information will help guide should the direction be more focusing on existing. And I agree with David Pyle, cumulatively speaking, I think development regulations in Sammamish across the board, especially stormwater, are more protective, call it stringent, than any other community. So is there any specific regulation, given all of that, that needs to be employed over and above all of that? That's my comment on that. And given that holistic regulations for land development in Sammamish are far more comprehensive, prescriptive, protective, effective, whatever the right word is, than any of our peer cities. David talked about something that made me smile, didn't want to backslide. Well, I'm going to start with a backslide, but then I'd like to change the term. Let me dive into this part of the comment. What if we create a slightly bit relaxed set of critical area and other standards for roughly 5% of the city? And I'm going to give a precise example for context here. It would be for roughly 3 to 4 to 5% of the city. And if we, for sake of discussion only, if we say that our regulations in Sammamish are on average a scale of 9 out of 10 compared to other jurisdictions for their effectiveness and prescriptive nature, critical areas, the whole gamut. Let's say our community is a scale of 9 of 10. If that is applied in 95% of our city, and if we relax the standard to somewhere between 6 and 7, still darn good protection, just not quite 9 for 5% of the city, that's an average of an 8.85 factor, but we can get holistic housing for life and lifetime and add a set of holistic enrichments that far outweighs a 0.1 to 0.15 reduction in citywide critical area protection, still have higher than everywhere else, and actually come out, well, enrich and sustain and stay, which I like to say. So anyway, that's my comment, and what I'd like to suggest is that maybe we do a minor backslide to evolve to a place of major holistic advancements that far outweigh a minor change in the overall effectiveness of our critical areas. That's my comment for this evening. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks, Paul. Anybody else?
Nope, that's it.
Oh, great. Before we adjourn, Commissioner Bosworth, is this your last meeting with us? Am I correct about that?
You are correct.
So I wanted to just take a moment to say thank you for your service on the commission and to tell you how much I've appreciated having you as a commissioner. And I think everyone would probably agree, Carrie always brings thoughtful comments. She does a better job than me, at least, in preparing ahead of time. And yeah, you do. You read the details. I've really enjoyed having you on the commission, myself personally, and I think everybody else has appreciated your commitment to the commission, your dedication to these meetings, and your service to the community. So big thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to work with all of you, staff and commission, and also our folks who come and give public comment. So this has been an amazing experience. So thank you so much.
We'll look forward to some public comments from you, Carrie.
You bet.
Anything else? All right, everybody, make sure you take a look at the calendar, and we will see you February 1st. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody has to move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second. Moving to second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you.